Maldonado, and on behalf of the entire team of the World Affairs Council, welcome. We're so excited that tonight we are able to present Dr. Peter Hotez with an informative session on COVID and the potential future outbreaks and what we can expect going forward. Hopefully it's great news. Before we begin, I want to remind you just of a couple of things. I want to make sure you see one of our calendars. You can take this, great bookmark, and keep it in your car, and you'll know exactly what we're doing over the course of the summer. But a few things I wanted to point out. Next week, I'm so thrilled that we are having our Global Scholars Academy. This is a high school summer camp program for high school students ages 14 to 19. We are having a session in the Woodlands. We're having 2 sessions here over the summer in Houston. So if you have high schoolers in your little community, make sure they're aware that if they're interested in a career in international affairs or just working internationally, this is the place that they want to be. We also have an upcoming program on the important issue of understanding human trafficking and what we can do to stop it. That is going to be at the Second Cup. It's a coffee nonprofit here in town, and they will help you and instruct you on how you can assist in ending human trafficking. We also have some great spots available on our trip to Cuba, as well as Croatia. So if those 2 are on your bucket list, come see me afterward or any member of our team. And then later this month, we are all going to NRG Stadium to watch Copa de Lone Star. 2 soccer teams fight it out on the field, so if you're interested in soccer, you can sign up to join us. And then our fall kickoff program is going to include the former Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper. And everyone who registers will receive a copy of his signed book, so you won't want to miss that. That's going to be in early August. And a lot going on, but I want to make sure that you get all the information that you need. You can find it on here or on our website. We do add programs very frequently, so make sure you stay abreast. And if you're not getting our weekly newsletter, please call the office and we'll make sure we sign you up for that. Sometimes it falls into your spam folder, and we don't want that to happen. We want you to know exactly what your membership benefits entitle you to. And if you're not a member, you can easily sign up. And if you don't want to become a member, come out anyway. We're open. We'd love to have you. I do want to remind everybody, it's been a while since we've kind of had the opportunity to do our blue question card. So if you have a question of Dr. Hotez, or even Ronan, because Ronan's very smart, you can write these down, and my colleagues will be picking these up pretty much about 7:35 or so. So if you have a question, you can write these on there. And do include your name, and if you're a student, we'd love for you to include the school that you go to. So now it is my honor to open our program formally and introduce our speaker. Dr. Peter Hotez is the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine. He is also the co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development. Nominated this year for the Nobel Peace Prize for his combined work to develop a low-cost COVID-19 vaccine, and awarded the Scientific Achievement Award, one of the highest honors granted by the American Medical Association. Additionally, he's university professor at Baylor University, fellow in disease and poverty at the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy, and senior fellow at the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at Texas A&M. I know you've seen him all over the news the past 2 or 3 years. Let's give him a round of applause for his amazing work. Thank you. To introduce my colleague, Ronan O'Malley, who will have the pleasure of a discussion with Dr. Peter Hotez. Please.
And thank you very much, everyone here, for attending. It's great to kind of be getting back to in person, and our audience is coming back again. I know the summer is hard for students, but we look forward to getting back with a lot of students again in the fall and in the August and September. And Dr. Hotez, I just want to say congratulations. As Marion nominated, I mentioned you were nominated very deservedly so for the Nobel Peace Prize. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But I just want to say we're also delighted to have you back again. As a lot of you know, Dr. Hotez is one of our favorite speakers. I think it's hard to say now, 10 years at the council now, definitely a speaker I think we've hosted the most. And we're delighted to have
6 or 7 times, I think.
Yeah, I know, it's incredible. But we'll just to focus on COVID now, we might kind of open up a bit more at the end and kind of a broader discussion of kind of what you're working on going forward. If you're wondering, Dr. Hotez does not sleep, obviously. He has your 4th book coming out next year? 5th book, okay, 5th book. But just to look at COVID, it's staggering to think about. It's at least 6 million deaths. If you look at excess deaths in a lot of countries like India, Pakistan, Egypt, the rate might actually be 8 or 10 times higher, so it could be many times more than 6 million across the world. 6 million, sadly, died in the United States. At least 500 million people have been affected around the world. Those are confirmed infections. The actual rate's probably much, much higher. Before we get into the kind of specifics of COVID-19, could you talk about maybe what has surprised you and the scientific community from what we initially were trying to figure out in the first few weeks of January, February, March 2020, and where we are today?
Yeah, I think, for me, well, first of all, it's great to see everybody. I mean, I haven't done a lot of in-person events, so it's fantastic to see you. I'm sorry it's 100 degrees out, and it'll be 100 degrees for the next 5 or 6 years. It turns out this climate change thing is for real, isn't it? But
that's only science.
Yeah, exactly. I think the way, for me, the biggest, most profound disappointment is the lack of governance and the defiance of governance and how everything's become so chaotic, and the fact that the number that the World Health Organization is putting out there is 15 million deaths, and we're looking at over 1 million deaths in the United States alone. We're closing in on 100,000 deaths here in the state of Texas. This is probably the single greatest tragedy that's ever affected the state of Texas. And the part that I focus on is the world was caught off guard. We didn't understand how transmissible it was. We didn't understand it was as an airborne virus like it was. That was all understandable. The unforgivable part for me are the deaths that occurred after vaccines became widely available. So on May 1st last year, a little more than a year ago, the Biden administration announced any American who wanted to get a vaccine could get vaccinated. And yet there was this defiance and refusal. And in the new book I'm writing with the working title Anti-Science Kills, Johns Hopkins Press sometimes plays around with the title. The number that I'm putting out there is 200,000 unvaccinated Americans after May 1st last year, when vaccines were widely available, lost their lives because they refused to get vaccinated. They were defiant and trying to understand the forces that drove that. I mean, think about that. 200,000 Americans needlessly lost their lives because of allegiance to this thing, which we can talk about how that this was not accidental, and I don't call it misinformation or disinformation. I call it anti-science aggression, and we know who's responsible for it, and we can talk about that as we go further.
And we'll definitely get into it. But just in terms of terminology, just for people to know, coronavirus is a broad term for a family of viruses that often impact the upper airways. COVID-19 is the actual disease caused by this specific SARS-2 variant, right? Can you tell us about why this specific coronavirus was so deadly, was so infectious, has a reproduction rate and infectious rate, the R0 or R0 factor, that is so dramatically high that it spread at an incredible rate, and why was it so infectious, and why is it so deadly?
Yeah, it was the perfect storm of the unique features of this virus. So this is now our third coronavirus pandemic of the 21st century. Many people don't realize it. So we had the original SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, that arose out of Guangdong province in southern China in 2002. It spread to Toronto, caused a lot of devastation in Toronto. Actually, that shut down the city of Toronto, closed its economy. People forget about it. Now it took a Rolling Stones concert to bring people back into Toronto. But that, and then there was MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, out of Saudi Arabia. Now, the game changer there was, with the original SARS that arose out of southern China, if you had SARS, you were sick. You were feeling awful, and you knew you had to go to the hospital. And you went to the hospital, and the mortality was 10%. So there were about 800 deaths, several thousand cases. So this was a serious pathogen. But the point is, if you had SARS back in 2002, you weren't going out to concerts and museums and hanging around bars. You were going either in your bed at home or you were going into the hospital. The hard part of COVID-19 was about 40% of individuals had no symptoms at all, and they were subsequently spreading the virus around. And that, and actually, it all comes down to a few amino acids in the spike protein and something called the furin cleavage site of the virus, the difference between the two. And those little changes had all the difference. So it's a simple change in chemistry had all of the impact in terms of why COVID spread around the world, whereas SARS ultimately became relatively contained. Even though the mortality rate of COVID-19, SARS-2, was less than SARS-1, it was sufficiently high to cause those massive numbers of death and allowed the virus to permeate the entire planet.
And just for people to get a degree of perspective, there are not direct parallels, but in some ways in my head, just because usually we're dealing with geopolitics, and I've had a lot more high-level intelligence officers on this stage than scientists. But sometimes with intelligence, a lot of times you don't really know what's going on at first. And sometimes whatever might be reported to the press or gets out there is not necessarily accurate. Can you talk about, I suppose, just two of the things that a lot of people are critical or perhaps dubious regards to the government response in 2020? Initially was, Dr. Fauci, who, like we've talked about before, you've known for years. Initially in January had said, in essence, there's no need to worry. We're going to keep our eye on this virus, but there's no need to worry for the American public right now. Obviously, that progressed, and he said some things differently. And also, some people would say, well, he also suggested don't necessarily need to mask up. Can you talk about what was it that was known or was not known, and or was some of this, when it comes to, say, masks, that the government was perhaps realizing we don't have enough masks out there. We have to have the relatively low number of masks we have available to medical community. Can you talk about the initial government missteps and maybe what was the rationale behind them?
Yeah, so the SARS-2 virus that caused COVID-19 was about 80% similar in terms of its genome to SARS-1. So when we first heard about SARS-2, we said, we've got this. This is going to be just like SARS-1, and we know what to do. And knowing what to do meant that, first of all, there was no such thing as asymptomatic transmission. In fact, the Chinese had told us that, and we didn't believe it. The CDC didn't believe it. So that was a huge mistake. And I think the other was thinking that this was a purely respiratory virus, not understanding that this caused cardiovascular illness and thrombotic diseases as much as others. So I think the CDC went into kind of automatic mode and said, this is going to be another SARS. Yeah, we'll have, it's a serious illness, high mortality, but it's going to be a limited outbreak. And that drove all the decisions about vaccine doses. It made all decisions about how the CDC responded. And that then led I can't call it a comedy of errors because it was too much loss of life, but it led to a series of missteps. So, and one followed after another. So first of all, there was not the appreciation of understanding that this was going to be a pandemic affecting the entire country. And there was a lot of focus on halting importation of the virus from China, so they put in, the Trump administration put in the travel bans from China, not knowing by the time they did that, the virus had already reached Southern Europe, and the virus had already stealthily come in from Southern Europe into New York. That was, so while everyone was focused on travel bans from China in January, March, and April of 2020, the virus was already here in New York. It ignited that big, that terrible first epidemic. And then people assumed it was a respiratory pathogen, first and foremost, and therefore you had to focus on management of the airway and intubation, not realizing that this was causing microclots in the bloodstream. And I have to say, the docs in New York figured it out pretty quickly, and they together with the UK doctors, because this was affecting the UK, putting dexamethasone in, and then putting people, and they quickly figured out to put people on anticoagulants. So the medical community responded in a very heroic and quick way. But then we were starting to realize that people were coming in with profoundly low oxygen saturation because of all those micro blood clots, and not putting them on anticoagulants. Then there was I think then the other catastrophic failure that happened after that was insisting on leading the COVID response in Washington, D.C., and not putting the CDC out in front. And I think that was probably a misstep also in 2020. But then, in fairness, the CDC started making a lot of epic fails, right? They could never get the diagnostic testing underway. They could never get the genomic sequencing underway. Now 3 years into the pandemic, they finally figured it out. They couldn't get, and because they weren't out there leading a response, the thinking in the Trump administration at the time was, we have to put the states out in front. And the states never had the intellectual horsepower to know how to do this, right? This was a very complicated pandemic. This was where you needed the full force of the federal government. But there was this obsession with states' rights. The states had to be in the lead. They never had the chops to know how to do this. So each state led its own response, and most states kind of screwed this up in a big way, and allowed transmission to subsequently occur. There was never mathematical modeling that was put out in place. So individual universities like University of Washington, Johns Hopkins put out their modeling to assess the epidemic. So it was a combination of a lot of missteps from the Trump White House that ultimately downplayed the severity of the pandemic, said COVID was a hoax, that the hospital admissions were catch-up in elective surgeries. And that's the one you hear about most if you watch the cable news networks. But the other piece that people don't talk about as much, there was an equally epic failure of the CDC that couldn't organize itself to respond appropriately. With the Biden administration, a lot of those things were fixed, but we still have, and the CDC response is still a work in progress that we still have to fix.
And we'll talk about it at the end as well, but the CDC would get poor marks for its response, even still under the Biden administration, just because it is something people hear about. With Fauci early on saying, we don't advise people wearing masks. What do you think was the rationale behind that?
I think the rationale behind it was the fact that with the original SARS, the thinking was it was spread like the flu with just droplet contact. So in other words, if I had SARS, you got it because I sneezed or coughed, and microdroplets landed on the mucous membranes of your nose and mouth, or they landed on the table and you picked it up by hand contact. That's how flu is spread. And remember, we were told that we had to wipe down all the FedEx package UPS, and we're all doing DoorDash and practically sterilizing it before you got to eat. It was all garbage, right? It was all not true. This was all through airborne transmission. And again, the Chinese scientists did tell us this, but there was a lot of skepticism, and I have to place some blame with the CDC on that as well.
And just so people are clear, what you're saying is, as far as you know, the Chinese scientists were aware of how it's transmitted, but they weren't being forthright in letting the WHO and the world community know what they actually realized about transmission.
Well, they were forthright in some things, and they obfuscated in others. What they were forthright of was that they had come to the conclusion this was an airborne virus and you better wear masks, which was mostly ignored by the CDC. What they were not forthright about was the fact that this was a virus that arose out of the wet markets that were in Wuhan and elsewhere in central China. And I used to do a lot of work in China. I've been to those wet markets. They're pretty awful place. I used to call them the killing fields because they were lessons in how you kill live animals in front of the patron. Awful organization that they were supposed to shut down after SARS. And so the culpability there was they didn't shut down the wet markets and were not willing to admit that. But they did tell us about the airborne nature of the virus. They did tell us about the fact that masks were going to be first and foremost. So that there was a lot of distrust of what was going on in China as well, and rightly so, because they did obfuscate. But all of that led to a lot of misunderstanding, and of course, then people stopped trusting the CDC and parts of the federal government as well when they got it wrong.
And just for people who may have heard it, but not as au fait with what it all means, the wet markets you're referring to is in China, and it's common in much of Asia, parts of the Middle East. They are markets where everything is sold. It might be vegetables, it might be fruits, but also a lot of times animals, a lot of times live animals, and sometimes wild animals, here like civets or pangolins, which might be vectors for transmission. But in a wet market where animals animals are stacked on top of each other, they're stressed, they're starving, they're defecating and urinating on top of each other, there's a high likelihood of transmission of disease, right?
Yeah, when I used to keep a lab, we used to keep a lab in China, in Shanghai, at the Institute for Parasitic Disease, not for viruses, but my other big interest is parasitic diseases. But you go a few blocks to the wet market, and as I said, I used to call it the killing fields. There were these poor animals, stuffed into small cages, exotic animals, things like turtles. And okay, you want to buy a turtle for your turtle soup? They would literally, rip the shell off the turtle while alive and stuff it into the bag, and there in the little baggie, and there you go. Or there was this one lady, I'll never forget, who knew how to flay a whole quail alive. Ripped everything off the clay, into the bag, and this is a tradition of China. But when it became clear that SARS, the original SARS, was transmitted from this exotic animal called a civet cat. It's not really a cat, but it's it's a sort of it's a furry animal. And China made a vow that they were going to shut down the wet markets after that, and they didn't, because it was too ingrained culturally, too much fight, and I think that's a reason why the Chinese covered it up a lot, because the government had failed to really clamp down.
And just for people to know, you're talking about the initial, what we call SARS outbreak in 2003, where the Chinese did some restrictions and limitations on the wet markets, but after a few months, everything was back to normal. And they did the same thing with COVID-19.
And then in Wuhan, in central China, it was business as usual by 2019.
And then to turn to China and the origins of COVID, what a lot of people have questions about. You wrote an article a lot of people might have read last year, really in a lot of ways definitively saying we don't necessarily know what the definitive origins of COVID are, but we know what is necessary to determine that. And that requires a wide degree of cooperation from the Chinese, from the scientific community, which requires government cooperation. Can you talk about what you feel would be necessary to determine the actual origins of COVID?
Well, the reasons we started working on coronavirus vaccines was as follows. I mean, most of our group at the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development was focused on parasitic infections like schistosomiasis and Chagas disease and leishmaniasis. I like to say we make the vaccines that the big pharma companies are not in a position to make or not interested in make because they're for poverty-related diseases. And then about 11 years ago, when we first came to Houston, we started a coronavirus vaccine program because I said, these are orphaned just like our parasitic disease vaccines are. Nobody's interested in making them. And I said, look, you've had SARS in 2003, you had MERS in 2012. Mother Nature's not being coy here. She's telling us what's going to happen. There's going to be a third major coronavirus pandemic, and we started making coronavirus vaccines, and we got a $6 million grant from the NIH to make vaccines for SARS and MERS. That's what allowed us to hit the ground running for COVID-19. The point is, COVID-19 was predicted and predictable. I mean, I couldn't tell you it was going to rise in 2019 or 2017 or 2023, but we knew it was going to happen. So when all of this speculation came about that COVID-19 was genetically engineered, I said, there's no reason to invoke that because we knew this was going to happen. And it happens because of this perfect storm of the fact that we now have widespread deforestation. Humans are coming into contact with bats. And bats are the natural reservoirs not only of coronaviruses, but also Ebola virus infection and Nipah virus infection. And so it has to do with this aggressive urbanization and deforestation. And of course, if you've ever been to central China or southern China, it has another added feature, which is that even among rural populations, there are a lot of people in those rural populations. I mean, there's 1.3 billion Chinese. And even though we call it rural, it's really very urbanized. And on top of the fact that you're deforesting the area and coming into contact with wild animals like bats, you also have the wet markets, and it's this whole storm of pigs and chickens and goats and every animal under the sun, all mixed with human habitats, and that's the reason why we see the avian flu viruses or the porcine flu viruses arise out of China. That's why we do annual surveillance in China, because it's this vast mixing bowl of humans and animals. So COVID-19 was expected, and the problem is when COVID-19 emerged, there was a lot of anger, of course, and the fact that the Chinese were obfuscating. They were obfuscating because they were hiding what they were doing about the wet markets. I don't think they were designing COVID-19. But what happened was, it rose out of that area, and so people naturally, and the other thing that happened with China was after the original SARS, just about every major medical research university and institute started working on coronaviruses because they knew that they had to develop countermeasures. And so people just gravitated to the Wuhan Institute and assumed that must be where the place it arose. The metaphor or analogy that I like comes from my good friend Mike Osterholm. He says, what if there was a major new outbreak of an infectious agent that occurred in the Caribbean, right? Where do we find it first? The answer is Atlanta, right? Because of all the air flights that are going in from the Caribbean to Jackson Hartsfield Airport. And what do you have in Atlanta? You have the CDC, right? So you would just assume then that this was a lab leak from the Centers for Disease Control, when of course it obviously is not. So it's the same thing I think would happen in China.
But in terms of actual definitive answers, we're a long way from it and probably may never get to it. Can you talk about what the actual, intense, researchers would need to determine the origins of it, and what they don't have? Say, for instance, we don't have Are they given the actual, blood samples and data for the earliest known patients? Are they given what is known from the Wuhan Institute? What is needed and what has actually been achieved?
It is an outbreak investigation in central China. By the way, it may not have started in Wuhan, likely somewhere else in central China. And we need an international team, which include Chinese scientists, but also international scientists, of epidemiologists, of bat ecologists, of interdisciplinary experts in immunology and microbiology to do a thorough outbreak investigation. It'd probably take more than a year to take saliva samples, blood samples from the bats, from the other livestock to see if that was an intermediate host, for some of the exotic animals used in the wet markets, from people to find the index case, the original index case. It's a lot of work. It's doable. But the problem now is we're in a geopolitical standoff between China and the rest of the world, and they're not going to let that happen. And the problem is, with all the conspiracy theorists out there, it creates a very toxic environment, who are going to insist that what we got to do first and foremost is bang on the door of the Wuhan Institute of Virology and say, let me in and show me your notebooks, right? I mean, so, what are you supposed to see in your notebook, in those notebooks? I mean, first of all, they're all in Chinese, right? And so, and second, I mean, what are you supposed to do? Scan through hundreds of thousands of pages of notebooks and look for the word "whoops" in Chinese? I mean, it's just silly. And the arguments that the conspiracy theorists use, the gain of function people use, is they say they're all these smoking guns.
And just for people to understand, gain of function refers to not just in Wuhan, but all of the advanced research centers around the world. Gain of function is when you would take a virus, you would purposely and skillfully increase its capabilities or maybe even its lethality with the idea to study it more closely for developing a vaccine or understanding of it.
That's right. So the accusation is either through NIH, U.S. National Institutes of Health sponsored research, or through Chinese research, that Chinese or U.S. scientists were inserting specific sequences of genes, which ultimately become amino acids, into the virus to make it more transmissible. And they point to a specific area of the genome of the virus called the furin cleavage site, which they say is not present in SARS or in SARS, although it was present in MERS. To which I say, look, that furin, and they claim that's a smoking gun for all of this. And I say, look, I mean, furin cleavage sites are in every subfamily of coronaviruses, so it doesn't really hold water to say that's a smoking gun, to say that this is evidence for it. And so and all that really does is it gets everybody's back up and makes it less and less likely that we're going to do a proper outbreak investigation in central China, which is too bad because we really don't understand the whole forces that either led to SARS, MERS, or COVID-19. And guess what? As a consequence, we're going to have COVID-26 and we're going to have COVID-32. I don't really know it's going to be 2026 or 2032, but you get the idea that we're going to have future ones.
And just to leave it where we'd leave it, maybe paraphrase you, it sounds like you're saying not that a lab leak of some, from Wuhan is impossible, but more likely it was a naturally occurring virus that got transmitted outside of Wuhan, or maybe came to the wet market. But at the end of the day, since the Chinese are not fully cooperating, we'll never actually have a definitive answer.
Right, and the fact that now you've got all of these groups that are trying to FOIA, Freedom of Information Acts, U.S. scientists, also the fact that there's a lot of, it's no secret that people like Rand Paul and others in Congress hate Tony Fauci. And so they want to pin something on Tony Fauci, so they're constantly sort of stirring this up in order to find some smoking gun that's resulting from NIH-sponsored research around gain of function, and it's really unfortunate because I'm pretty convinced, as are just about all of my colleagues in the virology community. In fact, one individual at the University of Washington, Seattle, has now put in preprint form papers showing that this virus actually jumped twice from bats to these an intermediate host, most likely something called a dog raccoon, whatever that is, to humans. So I think that's a much more plausible story given everything we've seen about SARS in the years.
And lastly, related to China and the WHO, the World Health Organization, a lot of people were critical of their response in the first few months. Is there also just an inherent conflict of interest in the fact that, like any multinational organization that depends upon its funding from member states, the WHO gets about 14% of its revenue, of its budget from China, that perhaps even subconsciously are going to be less willing to be critical of a major contributor?
Yeah, it's not like the UN agencies have a guaranteed annual budget. It's not only true of the World Health Organization, it's also true of UNICEF and UNESCO and the World Intellectual Property Organization. The list goes on. They have to raise that money every year. And by the way, the budget of the WHO is extremely modest. So you're paying right now $15 billion in tax money to fund the CDC every year. The whole budget of the World Health Organization, I think, is $3 to $4 billion. So it's a fraction of what the CDC is, and yet they're supposed to do that for the whole world. And so we're just not prepared to invest that level for international governance in health.
And you touched upon it earlier. I think one of the things I suppose we try to do here at the council is be nonpartisan. We'll bring in Republicans, bring in Democrats, but hopefully have people from the left and from the right look at an issue and hear people who are experts and give them the time to hear their perspectives. I think one of the greatest tragedies is that this became a political issue. You're an incredible trained scientist for decades. You had not been directly involved at this level in politics. Can you talk about, sadly, kind of, maybe what this was like for yourself? We're blessed to have hosted you many times before this. In some ways, I kind of feel it's like, you have that favorite band. You're like, oh, I knew them before they were playing in Reliance Stadium, before they played at Fenway Park. We knew you back when you were just a great scientist, but you weren't on CNN, you weren't on Fox, you weren't on MSNBC. Can you talk about what it's been like personally, and maybe for the scientific community more broadly, of what it's like that this became a media storm, this became a political issue?
Yeah, it happened at multiple different levels. In the past, Ronan, when you've had me, I've spoken a lot about actually my family, because I have 4 adult kids, including Rachel, who has autism and intellectual disability. So we live in Montrose, and Rachel works at Goodwill 2 hours a day. And if you're driving in the morning in Montrose, you'll see her. She's got this big shock of red hair, and she's become a Montrose personality unto herself. And I wrote this book, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, which talks about our life in Montrose and also why the overwhelming evidence shows vaccines do not cause autism, because that was the original assertion. And unfortunately, that made me public enemy number 1 with the anti-vaccine group. So before the pandemic, one of the lead anti-vaccine activists labeled me the OG villain, which I had to look up. It means the original gangster villain. So you're having the original gangster villain here today. But that made me a target of anti-vaccine disinformation, anti-vaccine activism. So I not only became an expert vaccine scientist, but I also became an expert in vaccine anti-science and disinformation campaigns. So the reason that's relevant is, early in 2020, when the Trump White House, starting as it went into April and May, you started to hear COVID was a hoax, and the hospital admissions were for other reasons, and it's the flu or it's a cold, and then they started talking about using hydroxychloroquine which eventually became ivermectin, which was absolute nonsense. And I looked at this and said, you know, I've seen this before. I know what this is. This is an anti-science disinformation campaign. I know because I'm the expert. Not because I wanted to be the expert, I came by default. So I was one of the first to call it out on the cable news channel. And that's when the nighttime Fox News anchors cut me off. I was going on Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham, not Laura Ingraham, but Hannity and all those guys. And then they cut me off. And that was the hardest thing to do. And I remember, you know, if back then everything was kind of shut down, and I was doing the interviews from my computer in the corner of my bedroom, and my wife Ann and the cat were on the other side of the laptop. I said, Ann, I hope what I'm doing is okay. I mean, you know, it's not me to go into this political realm, and usually Ann is the one who kind of is the filter. She's the one who kind of keeps me from, because on my own I often tend to say unhinged things and can be quite unfiltered. She's always the one that's kind of keeping me down. And she said very uncharacteristically, look, you don't want to know 6 months from now all these lives lost, and you didn't do everything you could to save lives, and that's all I needed. And I just, you know, let that whole thing rip. And then I became a target from Fox News and others, and that was really tough. It's not that I wanted to politicize it. You know, they were politicizing, and I was basically saying, look, this is not your fight. You know, let's work together and save lives. And then this really accelerated in 2021 when you heard it at the CPAC conference, right? They said, first they're going to vaccinate you, and then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles. And I said, as ridiculous as that sounds, there's a quarter of the country who accepted it. And then vaccines are just political instruments of control. And you had Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene saying, the people who vaccinate you are medical brown shirts, using the Nazi paramilitary analogy. And then amplified by Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham every night. And they started targeting me. And that was tough because, you know, all of our training as scientists and physicians say, you know, you're not really supposed to talk about Republicans and Democrats and liberals or conservatives. We're supposed to be beyond this. But what do you do when the Kaiser Health Foundation, Charles Gaba, the health analyst, New York Times, Axios, National Public Radio, all found the same thing, that the people dying of COVID in 2021 was because they were refusing vaccinations, overwhelmingly in red states, overwhelmingly in counties that were redder than red. So as a surrogate measurement, Trump voters in the 2020 election. And that's still, for me, one of the hardest things to deal with, is that sharp partisan divide. And the point I would try to make is, look, everyone's entitled to their conservative views, even extreme conservative views, but don't adopt this one because it's killing. So my estimate, as I said at the beginning, 200,000 Americans have needlessly lost their lives out of allegiance to this thing, out of refusing to get vaccinated, and the disinformation coming out of Fox News and some of the other conservative news outlets. So it's still a very tough battle. And then, of course, you know, when Tucker Carlson and Loring will go after me, that's not the end of it, right? Then I get the onslaught. The onslaught is my whole inbox on emails, because it's not that hard to find it, or social media, or even physical stalkings. You know, what does it say? It says, the army of patriots is coming to hunt me down. And my first response is, well, I don't know why you need an army of patriots. It's just me and Ann and Rachel and the cat. I mean, it's one patriot should be, two patriots maybe, but really don't army of patriots. But, and then, you know, then it brings in the Houston Police Department, and they know I'm Jewish, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism there, so bringing the Anti-Defamation League has been very helpful, and the Houston Police Department's been great, and the Texas Medical Center security. But this is a new thing now that we're dealing with as a consequence.
I know, it's pretty horrific. I mean, it was bad beforehand, like I mentioned when we hosted you for your last book. and just escalated to an unfathomable level. Maybe just to look at something positive and uplifting. As people may remember in the spring, you're very rightfully nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. We'll see where that goes. Obviously, it'd be incredible if you won. But the work for which you did with your colleague, Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi, it's because, can you talk about Cobavax and what it is that you developed a vaccine that two incredible aspects to it. One is that it, relatively speaking, is a simpler vaccine to produce as opposed to Pfizer or something like that can be produced more easily in the developing world. And number two, you purposely, despite people say you're tied with big pharma, you're making lots of money, you made it patent-free. You made it available to the entire world. Can you talk about the vaccine you developed and why it was so meaningful?
Yeah,
and what it means maybe for the vaccine to actually be available to the rest of the world, not just the wealthy parts of the world.
And we're still waiting for our pharma check. It hasn't happened. So, Anne says if only, right? So, well, this was, we use, one of the things that we do with our vaccines is we're focused on making low-cost vaccines for low and middle-income countries. And it turns out that lots of countries make their own recombinant hepatitis B vaccine. It's made through microbial fermentation and yeast. You grow up a big vat of yeast that's genetically engineered to make it. And we did this for our parasitic disease vaccine. We did it for SARS and MERS. And I said to Mary and Lane, I said, we could do this for COVID-19. And we did. We were able to make a recombinant protein COVID-19 vaccine pretty quickly. And it's a vegan technology. No animal cells, no human cells. Lowest cost. So the vaccine is 145 rupees a dose. Anybody want to tell me 145 rupees? About $1.90 a dose. No limit to the amount you can make. And so we approached Operation Warp Speed to say, we can do this. But they were so focused on the pharma companies, we didn't get Operation Warp Speed. They got about $400,000 out of the NIH. What came to our rescue was local philanthropy in Texas. When people back in the Northeast said, why did you move to Texas? I moved to Texas because of the Texas Medical Center, Texas Children's Hospital, Baylor College of Medicine, which is the most, amazing medical center humans and God ever invented, but also the philanthropic environment here. So we were able to raise about $8-9 million from the Kleberg Foundation, the Dunn Foundation, the MD Anderson Foundation. Tito's Vodka gave us $1 million. Now, not endorsing alcohol consumption, but if you happen to have a vodka cocktail after this, make sure, you don't want to get the Russian vodka, right? You want to get Tito's vodka. Although I'm told that most of the Russian vodka is actually Ukrainian vodka. Yeah. But you want to go with Tito's anyway. And that's what we did. So we transferred, by then, people knew about us. We were getting desperate phone calls from ministers of science, ministers of health from countries all over the world, desperate for a vaccine. So what we decided to do this, we didn't file a patent. We put everything in the public domain, how we made it. And we provide the production cell bank, the information, how you transfer the technology. We did it at our own cost to help with the technology transfer. So we transferred the technology to India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and now Botswana. India is the furthest along, one of the big vaccine producers. There is known as Biological E. And after we transfer it, we let them own it. They work out with their own national regulatory, the WHO. And now 60 million doses has gone into kids in India through that process. So that's really exciting. Thank you. Thank you. And then the same with Indonesia. We also transferred the technology, and because it's vegan, they said, we can make this halal for Muslim majority countries. So I said, that's great. I like the joke I like to say is it took the Jewish guy to figure out how to make the halal vaccine for the Muslim world. So that's true interfaith stuff here. So that's very exciting. So that's in phase 3 trials now. And so it's moving. The tragedy is, had we gotten even a fraction of the support that the big pharma companies had gotten, who knows, maybe we could have done this a lot faster and prevented the emergence of the Delta variant out of the unvaccinated populations in India and the Omicron variant out of the unvaccinated populations in Southern Africa. But there it is, but we're still making a lot of progress. And now we're working towards a next generation one, a universal coronavirus vaccine, also low cost. And so we have an extraordinary team of scientists in Texas Children's and Baylor gave us the opportunity to let the scientists work in the lab, even though everything was shut down because of the unique nature. And it's actually a side story I like to tell a lot, because going on CNN and MSNBC, you know how they portray us, right, back in the Northeast, right, with all the crazy, they emphasize all the crazy stuff. I came to Texas not for the crazy stuff, but because it's a state of innovation and science, and the Texas Medical Center, and it's a side of Texas we don't put out there enough, and I think not many people understand that. I could have been anywhere, but this 11 years that I've been in Texas has been the most productive of my scientific career, hands down, not even close to anything else, even before COVID, in terms of scientific publications and grants and all the work we're doing, for global health. It's very special what we have here in the Texas Medical Center. Thank you.
And I'll say I myself came to the United States because of the medical center. My parents are physicians. My dad came here for a fellowship, and I guess like a lot of immigrants, it's supposed to be 2 years, and here it is 40 years later. So the med center is incredible, and we should be appreciative of what we have here. It's truly staggering.
It really is.
I would I'm going to try and group the audience questions together, and ones that are relatively similar. We have a lot of good questions. So actually, do you mind staying a few extra minutes?
I'm happy to, yeah.
Okay. And if you all, the audience, if y'all don't mind either. Eric asks, why did China destroy or hide gene data? Is it possible that lab animal contamination escaped from the Wuhan lab into the wet market? And Mike, somewhat related to that, asks, you mentioned the U.S. surveils China. Could you elaborate on what that means, and how is it done in the medical context?
Well, this business of hiding the gene data, I haven't looked into it that closely, but my understanding is that it's not that the genes were hidden; they were kind of lost on the databases, and eventually they recovered them. But that was my understanding there. What was the other part?
And I suppose, is there any chance that this could have come from the actual Wuhan Institute? Yeah.
Sure. It's not. You look at. Is it possible that Ebola virus in Democratic Republic of Congo came out of a research lab in Democratic Republic of Congo? Of course. Is it possible that monkeypox arose out of a lab in Europe someplace? That's always a possibility. But there's 2 points to that. One, there is no reason to invoke it because we've got another more plausible, logical Occam's razor explanation. I think the second is there's still no evidence that there was gain of function, artificially created virus as a consequence. So, until something shows up, I think we have to be really careful about not being distracted. We still need to know the origins of COVID-19, and that's what we're failing to do. And it has huge global health consequences, not fully understanding all of the dynamics that led to SARS and MERS and now COVID-19.
And just related to that, whether it be the Wuhan Institute or some of the other places around the world that deal with the world's most potentially deadly viruses, especially if they're doing gain-of-function research. Some people have been critical with regards to the levels of protocols and security that were in place even before COVID. Is that a concern for you, that there has not been, absolute adherence to the strict protocols you need to make those labs safe, whether it be in Wuhan or other places?
Worried. We have a biosafety level 4 facility in Galveston, the Galveston National Laboratory, right? So I do think there is a lot of attention that's paid to that to prevent lab leaks, because the consequences of messing up, of course, are catastrophic. It doesn't mean that we can always use extra layers of belts and suspenders. I don't think anybody would argue against that. But but that's not a reason to say that therefore COVID-19 arose from this matter.
And just to bring it back to Texas, Bernard asks, given the number of bats we have in Texas, is there a possibility to see an outbreak that originates in Texas?
So a colleague of mine, and you know, a lot of the things are put up on these preprint servers to let anyone look at it. We do this as well, and then it goes to the actual journal. So on EcoArchive is a map now, a risk map of where the next coronavirus is going to emerge, and there are lots of sites in the Western Hemisphere in the New World. So absolutely, I think that's a real possibility.
Just aside from that, I would say any of you who've been out to the Frio River, beautiful part of Texas, the hill country, there is, if you go to the Frio bat, nightly, I suppose, when they come out, it's incredible. It's the most incredible natural phenomenon you'll see. I think it's about 12 or 13 million bats emerging from a cave there during the summer months. Off the subject, but it is a concern for you for bats.
But the good news is a lot of them are eating all the mosquitoes. So
yeah, absolutely,
they're doing a public service.
And just related to kind of more broadly coronaviruses in general, Diane asks, is it possible to identify other infectious agents that might generate future pandemics in advance, I suppose?
Yeah, this is a huge effort to try to predict and identify the next big pathogen. And as I say, most of these are the ones that are of greatest concern are of zoonotic origins, meaning animals to humans. And there's a concept out there called One Health, meaning that you really bring together the physicians, the biomedical scientists, the veterinarians, the ecologists, the environmental health experts together in one area to do this interdisciplinary assault on trying to understand new pathogens. I think we could do that in Texas better than anyone. I mean, we have, probably the best veterinary college in the country just up the road, right at Texas A&M. The Texas Medical Center. Why aren't we creating that One Health concept of a One Health Institute, which is exactly the one pager I gave to John Sharp and the Chancellor of Texas A&M and Paul Klotman, and I think that's a win-win. Oxford beat us to it. They've already created Pandemic Sciences Institute. I think because of all the veterinary and ag. I mean, if you've ever been to Texas A&M campus, the ag bio horsepower there is extraordinary, but we're not tapping it enough for linking it with the Texas Medical Center.
Yeah. I would recommend a visit. It is incredible vet school. My wife's a veterinarian. She went to Texas A&M, so I'll plug it. But outside of that, A&M is an incredible research institution. Just further related to the same issue, someone asked, how well are we prepared for false pandemics, and will they be appearing more frequently? And then Donnie asks, what's the next black swan disease that you're afraid of?
Well, what was the first part?
I suppose, are you concerned about false pandemics, something that I can only infer from their question that something that might be considered a pandemic and we overreact to it, and it wasn't truly a pandemic, and maybe it sets us back because
one of the biggest things I'm concerned is this rise in anti-science, anti-vaccine aggression, because now that these anti-vaccine groups are politically empowered, they've got money, they got organization. Even as COVID-19 dissipates, which it eventually will, it's not like they're going to fold the tent, right? They're going to go after all childhood vaccinations. They're going to, try to get us to stop vaccinating kids against measles and pertussis. That's already underway. I mean, if you look at the GOP platform that everyone focuses on the anti-gay, anti-abortion stuff, but if you read it, it says every Texan has a, quote, natural and unalienable right not to be vaccinated. So you know what they're going for. So that's trouble ahead. And the anti-vaccine movement is centered in Texas, which makes my life very entertaining. The other is, what's the next black swan event? We're not out of this black swan event. I got news for you. I mean, this BA.5 subvariant is highly transmissible. We still haven't vaccinated the world. So I can't promise you that something as transmissible as BA5, but is actually creating more severe disease, is still lurking. The bottom line is not only make sure you're vaccinated, but make sure you're fully boosted. And if you're over the age of 50, make sure you've had 2 boosts, and we may need a 3rd later on. Why the mRNA vaccines are not holding up as well as we'd like, I don't know. I mean, usually with pediatric vaccines, as you know, you're taking your kids to the pediatrician, you get a series of primary immunizations, you wait a year, and then you boost, and you've got 5 to 10 years of protection. That's not happening now. So maybe we need to look at other vaccine technologies. And when I say that, I get accused of conflict of interest, and I'm pushing our own vaccine, which sort of the case, but not entirely. But I think we have to look beyond mRNA to look at how we can get a longer lasting booster.
I suppose 2 related questions. Mike asks, local fundamentalist Christian churches appear to spread anti-vax information. Would you explain why this is happening? And then Julie asks, why are doctors, why are, I suppose, some doctors telling people falsely that Americans should believe them and refuse to vaccinate, I suppose?
Well, again, this kind of sort of far-right adoption of the anti-vaccine movement, I don't get it. I mean, as I say, everyone's entitled to their views, but why on God's earth the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers are marching at anti-vaccine rallies? I mean, there's no logic here, other than the fact that this is kind of another way to exert control. And I think what happened was a few years ago, maybe because I did such a good job at debunking the autism links, the anti-vaxxers needed a new thing, and they needed to re-energize, and they found it by linking themselves to far-right extremism. They created a political action committee. We have our own anti-vaccine PAC here in Texas, Texans for Vaccine Choice. And I think on the far-right side, they welcomed the opportunity because it was a pre-made ready cohort of people to now adhere to far-right views. So now you're starting, a few years ago, the anti-vaccine groups were not necessarily politically aligned one way or the other. Now they're all totally bought into the far-right stuff.
And just, in balance, especially before COVID, a lot of it was coming from what we might have traditionally thought was the left. A lot of these anti-vaccine groups were stronger in places like California, stronger in Portland,
there was
stronger
sort of
in
the
Seattle.
peace, love granola, got to be
The idea
careful
that
what
won't
we
put
put into
anything-
our vaccines.
Yeah.
And that's still there to some extent, but overwhelmingly now this is a red state phenomenon.
Okay. But there still are left-wing aspects to it as well. Right?
Yeah, as I say, this is not fun to talk about, right? I mean, the way I say it is, these are not your Jim Baker Republicans, right? I mean, these are people who really care about country and who think about country first and foremost. This is something weird and twisted that's going on.
And just kind of in a follow-up to that, another not necessarily easy question, but someone asked, Dr. Hotez, you warned about reopening schools, that this would lead to sick teachers and students, and you also warned that there would be zero chance for the unvaccinated to make it through 2021. You were wrong on these 2 fronts. How do you justify this information?
Well, I disagree with the premise. I mean, first of all, I mean, during 2020 and 2021, the teachers, the principals, the parents were scared, right? And I spent probably at no cost, just giving my time and everything else, talking to teachers and school boards and principals every day. I was on a Zoom call, and not only in Harris County in Houston, but also in HISD, but also throughout the state of Texas, and doing this nationally. I was talking to school systems in New York State, I was talking to them in California, I was talking to them in Alabama, and advising them on what we knew at the time about the virus, how to work with the plexiglass, how to, do the screening. And I did that so we could keep schools open safely. And And I couldn't have worked harder to keep schools, because I'm a parent, right? And I know 4 kids. Don't do it, by the way. And I, as a parent, my wife and I knew more than anything about the importance of keeping kids in school. So we did everything. I did everything I possibly could to ensure that kids get through school safely. The problem was there were peaks, right, during that big alpha wave in January of 2021, where New York City, I think in 1 week, was losing 12 teachers from COVID-19. And the teachers were scared about coming to work. And I was very supportive of the teachers and the teachers union to say, look, during peaks of super high transmission, maybe that's not the best time to keep the schools open, and to reduce attendance in the classroom and everything else. So if that was a mistake, hopefully it saved some teachers' lives too. I mean, they're our heroes, right? And they're getting beat up. They were getting beat up terribly, and they were scared for their lives pre-vaccine. Once teachers started getting vaccinated, then I think you had a lot more wiggle room to do things.
Someone asked, I'm a pulmonologist. I've been, TMA, I assume, Texas Medical Association has been quite helpful and active. On the other hand, I've been disappointed with the AMA, the American Medical Association, on a national level for being relatively silent. Is this my perception that the AMA is subject to perhaps external pressure? And I would have expected the AMA to speak as the national voice for physicians. What's your take on the AMA?
I have a little bit different perspective on the AMA, because they were certainly good for giving me a voice, and they had me on pretty regularly on their podcasts to talk about whatever I wanted to talk about, it was pretty unfiltered. So I never felt any constraints at all with the AMA. So I'm not aware of any specific concerns, but always happy to have that conversation afterwards.
Just to turn to a few other questions. Nicholas asks, I've read some analysis based on genetics separation modeling that post/late that Omicron may have actually been a variant that predated the original 2019 outbreak and conferred immunity in parts of the world like Africa and Asia before the pandemic. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I haven't heard that specifically about Omicron, but it is interesting that there's some evidence that maybe COVID-19 arose earlier than the current narrative says, which basically says November, December 2019, and perhaps there was already COVID-19 already in Europe and elsewhere, several months earlier, which again gets back to the whole thing of why it's so urgent to do that outbreak investigation in central China to figure this out, because otherwise we're destined to repeat the same mistakes.
Just as a scientist, you've worked in this for decades. Why, leaving China out of it, politics out of it, why is it so important to actually be able to determine the actual origin of a pandemic virus like this?
Well, once you know in granular detail which species of bat, how it entered into the animal population, or whether it filtered through the animal population first or directly into humans, can give you a lot of information about what you need to do to limit that kind of bat to human, bat to animal contact, how to deal with deforested areas, what the impact of climate change is in all of this. It just stands to reason that it's not just a coronavirus, it's Nipah virus, it's Ebola virus. These seem to be the new normal now that's happening. The zoonotic transmission, monkeypox is another example. And Mother Nature is not being coy, as I like to say. She's telling us exactly what she has in store with us. And she's saying, until you guys figure this out, I'm going to continue to hurl new zoonotic viruses at you from animals to humans. And And it's up to us to do that interdisciplinary kind of work, to do it in the field and really understand at a very, very granular level what's happening. I don't think we understand that right now.
The onset of another.
Vaccinated, meaning only 2 doses, you are getting hospitalized. And we're still losing 300 to 400 Americans daily. Okay, it's not 2,000 anymore, but 300 to 400 Americans daily lost. That's still a leading cause of death in the United States, so something to take seriously. I'm sorry, the second.
Why does it seem one variant comes so quickly upon the kind of, I suppose, downward trend?
Yeah, we're just seeing this whole rotation of subvariants. I thought we had a handle on it because, we saw, before we had time, we saw Alpha arise, it hit the UK, we had time before it hit the US. Same with the Delta variant, it rose out of India, then the UK and the US. And I said, we got this, we know what's going to happen. And then Omicron rose out of Southern Africa, hit the UK, and rather than that 3 or 4 week delay, because I thought we were going to get through the Christmas holiday before it, bam, it hit after a week or two. And ever since then, we've seen this succession of subvariants, which has been really challenging.
And there's no real determination of why or how the rate at which they come.
If it's helpful, we did see this pattern in South Africa. So it was the same pattern in South Africa. It's just that it reproduced in the UK and the US almost simultaneously.
Okay.
Before we had a bit of a lag.
Okay. Linda asks a good question. Some people might be curious. Linda says, is there a way to support Dr. Hotez's work in his vaccine development at Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's?
Oh, that's nice.
Yes.
So if you go to my Twitter site, pinned to the top, and there's a donation page for the Texas Children's Hospital Center for vaccine development, or you can just contact Texas Children's Development. That's very kind, and because we depend on philanthropic support. We're not a pharma company. We don't get pharma money. We don't get a lot of government money either, so it's mostly through private philanthropy that we can do what we do.
And lastly, just in conclusion, maybe what are the lessons we have learned, and sadly, maybe what are the lessons we should have learned? Earlier tonight you mentioned SARS. The original SARS 2003 had a mortality rate of close to 10%. COVID-19 is dramatically lower than that, far less than 1%. MERS, very high mortality rates. If we get another devastating pandemic that is this infectious, but multiple times more deadly, are we prepared for it?
So I'll take the liberty of changing your question around, because that's exactly what could happen with COVID-19. I mean, fortunately, we've not seen an increase in virulence with these new subvariants. But what if we do? What if the next one coming out of an unvaccinated population out of Nairobi or Kinshasa turns out to have the same transmissibility of BA5, but it's 5 times more lethal? That still could happen because we're failing to vaccinate the world's low and middle income countries despite our efforts to get our vaccine out there. So yeah, that's not only something in a distant theoretical possibility, that's a real thing that could happen by fall.
And lastly, what would you like to leave us with to think about, or maybe kind of, last, concerns about COVID or just our overall national and global preparation for the next pandemic?
Well, I'll switch it up a little bit and say, during this time in COVID-19, there's been an assault on science and scientists like I never dreamed, right? I mean, when I got my MD Ph.D. in New York at Rockefeller and Cornell in the 80s, I always thought of devoting my life to making vaccines was something noble. I never dreamed that there would be this kind of level of aggression against science and scientists. And what I like to remind people is that ultimately the U.S. is a nation that's built on science and technology. We're a nation of great research universities and institutions. The state of Texas is a state built on the University of Texas and Texas A&M and Baylor College of Medicine and MD Anderson and Texas Children's Hospital. And so we have to understand that these are national treasures. and not something to attack for purposes of political gain or political expediency.
Well, lastly, on behalf of the council and all of us here, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening and for your decades of work and your perseverance in the face of some of the most horrific threats and security challenges that a scientist shouldn't have to face. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming out tonight.